The presentation you're about to see was for the unveiling of the Eye Airfield Memorial at Progress Way at Langton Green, which was then the wartime entrance to the airfield. What this presentation shows is a collection of photographs that are representative of Eye Airfield during the war and the general area, and it will give you a greater insight as to the intensity of airfield construction in Suffolk, Norfolk and Essex in the Second World War. The first photograph we see is with regard to the World War II airfield construction programme, which at the time was the largest civil engineering project ever to take place in this country, with nearly 500 military airfields being built for the purpose. At peak period of construction, a military airfield was being started somewhere across the United Kingdom every 3 days. By the winter of 1942, there were over 75,000 British and Irish civilian employees being used to aid military construction projects across the United Kingdom as a whole. And this photograph, although we don't know its exact location, we know that it's one of the wartime airfields in East Anglia, and it shows the civilian workers doing runway maintenance. Many household names in terms of British construction and civil engineering companies owed their survival to the wartime airfield construction programme. Companies like Hay Mills of Stowmarket, Taylor Woodrow, George Wimpey, the Bulmer Brick Company down near Sudbury, all of these companies that would have otherwise had no work because all of the workforce were overseas fighting. A lot of men were in retained positions where they were not eligible to sign up and go off to war because the construction work they were doing in this country was so important. And this is just a representation of some of the companies across the United Kingdom that were involved in the airfield construction project. For the majority of people, certainly in East Anglia, the overwhelming majority of people had never seen a black person before, and it wasn't until the arrival of the black Afro-American engineers of the United States Army, coming directly from the southern states of Louisiana, Alabama and upstate New York, that this situation changed. Specifically to Eye Airfield, the men of the 827th, the 829th and the 847th Engineer Aviation Battalions, who were initially based under canvas at Oakley Park on the outskirts of Hoxton, and then latterly at Hawley Park just off the A14 near Stowmarket, were all living under canvas. The construction of Eye Airfield commenced in September 1942, but it wasn't until April 1944 that the airfield became fully operational. When building the airfield, accommodation was built to accept 2,894 full-time operational staff, all required to keep 30 bombers airworthy. In this photograph taken by the RAF on the 8th of November 1942, you can clearly see the A140 Norwich to Ipswich Main Road running up the left-hand side of the photograph, and the construction of the main runway that still remains at Eye today. You can see it being roughed out across the farmland that would have been requisitioned in order to build the drome. 9th Engineer Command was the organisation responsible for building a large proportion of the American-occupied airfields in East Anglia. This organisation consisted of some 21,600 men that were divided into 18 individual aviation battalions. Their primary role was the construction and ongoing maintenance and defence of the airfields both in England and after D-Day into Northern Europe. These men worked a minimum of 10 hours a day. 1 day in 10 would be entirely devoted to military training. They worked a 7-day week, and they were routinely reminded that they were first and foremost soldiers and secondly engineers. Unlike the white men of the 8th Air Force, who were actually operating from the aerodromes, the black men of the engineer aviation regiments were pretty poorly treated, and this is quite evident when at the end of the war the souvenir booklets that were put together by the organisations as a keepsake to document what they had done in the war were little more than photocopied pamphlets for the aviation engineer regiments, in stark comparison to the prestigious booklets that were put together by the bomb groups. Be that as it may, these are the only photographs really of any consequence that exist showing the construction operations of the Engineer Aviation Regiments. In the photograph on the left hand side, the caption says the 829th puts down the first concrete at Eye on Potash Lane, and on the right hand side, view of the Eye mess site from the water tower, living sites in the distance. Unfortunately, these pictures do not have the definition that we would ideally like. The photographs in the top left that show 4 separate pictures showing the men lined up are all taken at Oakley Park. As you climb into Hoxton, coming from the direction of Oakley Village, as you come up the brow, Oakley Park was on the right hand side at the top before you then drop down into the main village. On the bottom right hand side we can clearly see a black and white photograph showing the black engineers and the white officers in their dress uniform marching into church in Eye for Thanksgiving in 1943. That would be November 1943. This is an official photograph that has come from the American Air Force Museum at Duxford near Cambridge, and the official caption on the back reads, 20-year-old Master Sergeant Knowles Freeman from Pensacola, Florida, atop of a giant bulldozer. He is a member of the 829th Engineer Construction Company building an airport near Eye, England, March the 2nd, 1943. This large construction equipment was quite incredible for the local people to see, particularly the youngsters, who, for the vast majority of people, they had never seen commercial machinery or military machinery quite on this scale for construction purposes. Although we don't know the exact location of this photograph, it's entirely representative of exactly what took place at Eye Aerodrome during the construction. The soldiers of an Engineer Aviation Battalion had an extremely tough and hard war, and they received very little recognition for the work they did. The truck here is a General Motors Corporation 6x6 truck, 6x6 meaning 6 driving wheels as opposed to 4x4 which is 4 driving wheels, and this is a dump truck used for moving aggregate to aid the construction program. In September 1993, one of the white officers from the 829th Battalion returned to the local area to see what was left of the efforts they had put in during the war, and he was absolutely astonished to find that the majority of the main runways at Eye Airfield were still fully intact. This is First Lieutenant Raymond Dozier. The photograph on the left shows him in his dress uniform during the war, along with the other officers of his unit at the top, and the more contemporary picture from 1993 on his return to the airfield. Another official photograph from the United States Air Force Museum at Duxford, a surface grader invented by Master Sergeant Martin, is shown in operation during the construction of Eye Airfield, England, June the 6th, 1943, which, as history now tells us, was 1 year to the day before the D-Day invasion on June the 6th, 1944. Here are some pretty staggering statistics for you to consider concerning the construction of just one heavy bomber airfield. 32,000 square yards of tarmac, 175,000 cubic yards of concrete required, 400,000 cubic yards of excavated soil. Where did it all go? 8 miles of hedgerows to be removed and 1,500 trees to be uprooted. Provision for 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel. That was increased as the war went on and the missions got further. 10 miles of electric conduit, 20 miles of drainage, 6 miles of water main, 4 miles of sewerage pipes, 10 miles of roads and 4.5 million bricks. This was just for the construction of one airfield, and they built nearly 500 of them throughout the war. And what did it cost back then to undertake this effort? Well, it was basically £500,000 to build the airfield and £500,000 to build all the infrastructure, the services, the buildings, the accommodation blocks, the hospitals, the dentists, the basketball courts, all of the necessary requirements to make these airfields the small, totally self-contained operation that they were, that were routinely carved out of the East Anglian flatlands. These photographs really show you what was involved in constructing a Class A airfield. The Left-hand photograph being the aforementioned picture we just saw, taken in November 1942, versus the photograph on the right taken in the spring of 1945, when the airfield was at absolute peak strength. You can see the town of Eye in the right-hand bottom corner of the photograph, with the old railway line heading along the bottom of the airfield into the terminus railway station at Eye. The road on the right that climbs up through the picture is the road up to Langton Green and then out to the Broome Crossroads. You'll notice that there's a section of concrete parking areas for bombers on the top left-hand side that actually stretches onto the other side of the A140. And you can see the A140 running down there into Yaxley Village, as it did back in those days before they built the bypass in the post-war years. It would be typical to have between 60 and 70 heavy bombers on the airfield in the spring of 1945. This photograph is taken in Stowmarket High Street in 1943, and it shows the black engineers of 9th Engineer Command, almost certainly the ones based at Hawley Park, just down the road, and there they are marching down Stowmarket High Street past Barclays Bank on the left, which is still in the same position today, Stead & Simpson's, a shoe shop, on the right. Just below that you can see a sign saying "To the Air Raid Shelter." The bus is going to Walsham Le Willows, calling at Needham Market, Stowmarket and Elmswell, and there's an American Army Jeep with the United States Mail parked in front of the motor coach. The famous 200 Voices United States Army Negro Chorus. They sang in London's Royal Albert Hall, toured the country and broadcast all over the world under the direction of Sergeant Alexander Jordan of St. Paul, Minnesota. And here they are at the airfield at Eye, 1st of September 1943 in this official photograph. All of these men would have been stationed under canvas in the immediate locality. When General Dwight Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, was writing his memoirs and his war record in 1947, he commented that I should say that the aviation engineers, along with the combat engineers, were amongst the most important people we had in the entire European war. That really does demonstrate just what a significant job those engineers did in the war years. Every one of the Class A standard airfields that were built were a significant effort and an enormous construction feat. If we take this photograph, we can see that the land occupied by the airfield was almost comparable to the land that was necessary in order to build all of the accommodation to house the near 3,000 men that were stationed on the airfield, the hospital, the headquarters building where the missions were planned, so on and so forth. And these went right down into Broome Village. You can see in the pink circle a little cross. Well, that's the church, that's Broome Church. So it shows just how the base was integrated right into the village and the village life. When the base actually became operational and the construction was finished, it was occupied by the 490th Bomb Group, who arrived direct from the United States equipped with the 4-engined heavy bomber, the B-24 Liberator, manufactured by Consolidated Aircraft Corporation and latterly Ford. They arrived here in April 1944 and really caused quite a stir with the locals when they turned up with 4 squadrons of heavy bombers. For the young men expected to do the job of ferrying these aircraft across to the target and home again, this was their living quarters. And this is a personal photograph of one of the men who was stationed at Eye in the war, and he's written on the photograph, "Our home in the ETO," ETO being European Theatre of Operations. They were somewhat flabbergasted that they travelled halfway round the world, yet their accommodation was going to be very cold, Nissen hut, little more than sheds, corrugated iron construction with brick end walls, and a pot-bellied stove at one end of the hut to try and keep the hut and the men warm, not very successfully. No insulation, only single glazing, and in the winter of 1944, which was a particularly bitter cold and prolonged winter, extremely cold for the men living in them. Another photograph from a veteran's scrapbook. Our airbase was named after a small town of Eye. And in the photograph, it's not particularly good quality, but you can see in the bottom left hand side the town of Eye and the railway line running down towards Eye, and the road stretching out to the right, the lower right of the photograph, heading up towards Langton Green. This photograph is taken looking in the direction of Bury St Edmunds. A lot of local friendships developed between the Americans far from home and the local people, and here's a nice photograph showing the then laundry boy Charles Flatman, who many local Eye residents will know as Councillor Flatman of this parish. Here he is in his British Army cadet's uniform, along with two of the American flyers beside their Nissen hut. And if you look at the pathway, it is little more than concrete paving slabs just put down somewhat hastily. A lot of these airfields had significant mud problems because all of the construction had caused no end of mud, and a lot of the pathways very quickly got waterlogged, so they tried to put these pathways down so the guys could keep their feet dry. Colour photograph of one of the aforementioned B-24 Liberators that the 490th Bomb Group arrived with when they came here in April 1944. This photograph just taken a couple of months later, in and around the time of the D-Day missions, June 1944, sitting on hard standing number 37, which if you were to go into the airfield today to go into the Roy Humphrey Empire and you go up the concrete road off the A140, this would be literally sat just on the left before you get to the perimeter track. By August of 1944, and in line with other 3rd Air Division airfields in Suffolk, the 3rd Air Division handed back their B-24 Liberators in preference to streamlining the organisation and going over to B-17 Flying Fortresses manufactured by Boeing, Lockheed Vega and Douglas. The idea being that it was quite challenging to mount missions where you had different squadrons of aircraft types all within the same formation. The payload of a B-24 Liberator was different to that of a Flying Fortress, the range was different, the preferred flying altitude was different, and in order to streamline the operation they felt it was better to transfer the remaining 3rd Air Division Liberators to the 2nd Air Division in Norfolk and fly in new B-17 Flying Fortresses from the factories in North America. And therefore the 3rd Air Division became entirely B-17 Flying Fortress. And here's one of the first B-17s to arrive with the 490th. This is coming in on the runway to the airfield. The cottages in the photograph there are the cottages at Langton Green on the right hand side opposite the entrance to Progress Way. So this aircraft would have been coming in short finals over the church at Eye, over the tower, and touching down on the east-west runway. And these were the passengers with one-way tickets. The bomb dump, which was positioned off of Castleton Way, heading out of Eye. None of the ordnance at Eye was undercover. Some of the earlier airfields constructed further to the west had undercover provision for ammunition. Eye was the second to last airfield to be built for the 8th Air Force Heavy Bomber Programme. After the engineers finished at Eye, they transferred to Debwich, and they built Debwich Airfield near Woodbridge. In fact, it was being built more or less at the same time as Eye. And then there were plans for another airfield to be built at Crowfield, just east of Stowmarket, north of Ipswich, but by which time the Allies had already undertaken the D-Day invasion and they were reclaiming a lot of the captured land in northern France. So there seemed no point in building any more airfields in England when they could be capturing recently liberated airfields in northern France, and so that's why Eye Airfield and then Debwich were the last two constructed. The bomb dumps, due to the late nature of these airfields being built, none of it was undercover. All of the ordnance sat out in the open, visible from the air and the road. This shows the A140 looking north towards Norwich, south to Ipswich, and the village of Yaxley, the Yaxley cherry tree just out of the picture. but gives a good indication of the vastness of the land that the airfield occupied. We can have an idea of the revised route of the A140 today, running the other side of the farm, and previously mentioned hard standings on the other side of the A140, where one squadron of heavy bombers would park. The hangar on the top right hand side, just below the word industrial estate, is still there today, and that is in Bartram's yard and used for storage. Some of the wonderful photographs in this presentation are with thanks to these men here, which was the photo lab and the officers and men of the photo office at the 490th Bomb Group at Eye. The officer in the middle, directly behind the sign in the darkish uniform, is Captain Arnold Delmonico, and he was in charge of this organisation. He had a great passion for history, and as such ensured that many hundreds of photographs of the 490th Bomb Group were saved for future generations to enjoy. This diagram gives you an indication of how the 8th Air Force was divided into 3 separate air divisions, 1st, 2nd and 3rd. The 1st Air Division occupied Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, Northamptonshire and a little bit of Essex. The 2nd Air Division were all airfields in Norfolk, and the 3rd Air Division were all airfields primarily in Suffolk, with 2 Flying Fortress units, the 100th and the 452nd, and actually the 96th Bomb Group as well, just over the border into Norfolk. So the 3 air divisions comprised the 8th Air Force as a whole, and you can see this diagram breaks it down into individual combat wings, then combat groups, and then squadrons. This photograph of Captain Roy Barraclough of the 490th Bomb Group at Eye really gives an indication of how dangerous the job was. Of all the combat jobs in World War II, from infantryman to submariner, none was statistically more dangerous than that of a man in a bomber over Germany. At peak strength, and by peak strength we mean December 1944, the United States 8th Air Force could assemble over 2,000 bombers and 1,000 escort fighters on a single mission. This represented 3,000 aircraft in the sky at the same time. This vast aerial armada, which would stretch from horizon to horizon and be well over 100 miles long, could contain anything up to 20,000 airmen in the sky at the same time on a single mission. These statistics were staggering in their day, but they're even more staggering 75 years on, when we think of how small our armed forces in this country are today. Whenever the bombers went over the Channel or the North Sea and into occupied territory, there was an admission charge. If the bombers missed the target and had to go back again the following day or the following week, the admission charge was double. So it was vitally important that the lead bomb aimer from the various squadrons was as accurate as they could possibly be in undertaking their grisly duty. This photograph shows a squadron of Flying Fortresses from the 486th Bomb Group that were stationed at Sudbury Airfield in the south of the county. This was the Harrowin-Mersburg mission on the 26th of November 1944, where the 8th Air Force was sent to bomb the oil refineries in that area of Germany. The Flying Fortress going down was nicknamed the Blue Streak, and you can see the propellers, parts of the aircraft, men without parachutes, as the aircraft received a direct flak hit on the bomb run and exploded right in front of the eyes of the other aircrews flying around it. Similarly, thought-provoking photographs showing the demise of heavy bombers involved in the around-the-clock bombing campaign undertaken by the Americans by day and the RAF by night. What you have to consider is these photographs were all taken in the heat of battle at very high altitude, and it was incredibly difficult to be able to get a camera mechanism to work under such hostile environment. It was not uncommon for temperatures to be minus 50 degrees in the bombers. They were totally unpressurized, so everybody had their own oxygen mask and oxygen system not like the aircraft of today that we fly aboard, which have all got a common oxygen system and are fully pressurized. The only way you could get a camera to work was to keep it under your armpit, take it out momentarily to capture the image you wanted, and then put it back under your armpit again to keep it warm and to advance the shutter mechanism and the wind-on mechanism to get the next frame through. Back on the ground, the open doors of the ambulance, the blanket across the body, and the entry hole in the fuselage showing where the flak or the shell has gone into the aircraft tells us everything we need to know about this picture. 29th of July 1944, a B-24 Liberator bomber coming in to the airfield, making it back from a mission, trying to land on the runway coming in from the north, from the direction of Norwich, to touch down on the runway. Unfortunately, it had two dead engines on one wing, sustained major battle damage over the target, and an aircraft with all the power on one wing is very difficult to control, and who knows what the condition of the aircrew were, whether they'd sustained injuries themselves. Fortunately, when they came over the Devil's Hand Basin, they pulled the power back to come into land, but the aircraft sank too quickly, hit the A-140 and literally cartwheeled and disintegrated, coming to a halt, as you can see in the photographs, directly outside the Broome Swan. 29th of July 1944. Local farmer Peter West was actually working on the land that day in that general area, and tells me he was one of the very first civilians on the scene of the accident. And although it looks like an accident that everybody would be killed, actually of the 9-man crew, only 2 individuals died of their injuries, 7 surviving. A lot of fatalities didn't necessarily occur due to enemy action, but occurred on training missions or as a result of bad weather. One such incident in January 1945 over Bury St Edmunds involved a formation of flying fortresses from the 490th Bomb Group here at Eye. This was a mid-air collision, 2 aircraft hitting into one another whilst getting into formation to go and head off to war. Out of the 19 aircrew aboard the 2 Flying Fortress aircraft, 16 were killed and 3 were very badly injured. All of the names of those killed are on the Roll of Honour in the Town Hall at Eye. Most of the wreckage from these 2 aircraft landed in and around the sugar beet factory at Bury St Edmunds, and you can see the wreckage in the right hand photograph in the sugar beet purification pool on the edge of the sugar beet factory. The American Military Cemetery at Madingley, on the outskirts of Cambridge, houses nearly 4,000 graves of American servicemen who lost their lives during the air battles of the Second World War. This land was donated for the purpose by Cambridge University at the end of the war. By the end of World War II, over 3 million American servicemen had passed through the United Kingdom, and this photograph of an American military convoy headed up by military police outriders going through London is entirely representative of what was such a common and everyday sight on the roads of the United Kingdom in the Second World War. You have to remember that petrol was severely rationed, so there was very little civilian traffic on the roads because you quite simply couldn't get the petrol, so nearly all of the traffic would have been of a military purpose. You will no doubt recognise this photograph, having been taken just a few yards from where you are watching this presentation in the library. This is the Kerrison Memorial in the centre of Eye, in and around VE Day, May the 8th, 1945. We know that it's victory time because all the flags are out, the bunting is across the high street. The White Lion Hotel on the right hand side, there's 2 American GIs walking up the pavement there in their dress uniforms. Other than the fact that it's entirely devoid of vehicles, this scene has hardly changed in 75 years. After victory in Europe was declared in May 1945 and the war in Europe was over, the Americans headed back home. The war in the Pacific was still ongoing, and when the American servicemen left East Anglia, they were fully convinced that they were going back to America to retrain and then be redeployed for bombing missions in the South Pacific. History now tells us that in August 1945 the Americans dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrendered, thus bringing the Second World War to its conclusion. But when the Americans left Ai and the locality, this wasn't the case, and they genuinely thought they would then be going on to the Pacific. At every airfield across the region, the local people gathered to wave the Americans off, bid them farewell for a safe trip back home. You have to remember that aircraft in those days did not have the range or endurance to be able to fly to America in one flight, so it was a question of island hopping, the same method that they'd used to get here in the first place. So that they would take off from here and probably go to Prestwick, Scotland and refuel, then fly to Iceland and refuel, and then go over to Greenland, over the top and then down into Goose Bay, Labrador, down the eastern seaboard of America, and then to wherever their ultimate destination was. This process could take several days, depending on the weather. A comparison photograph of the aforementioned picture showing the Kerrison Memorial and the centre of Ai. Again, we can see a modern day image that the location really hasn't changed very much at all. A couple of then and now shots. This shows a B-24 Liberator, 23rd of June 1944, according to the photograph. It's run off the end of the northern end of the runway and come to rest in the field at Broome, just at the end of Pretoria Villas, which is the gaggle of houses you can see in the distance. The comparison photograph taken more recently showing the Bartram's lorry, giving you an indication of where the B-1077 road is running down into Ai. Same location, was actually grassed back in the war rather than being used for arable crops, and this photograph is dated June 1945, so not long before they headed back home in July 1945, showing the reviewing the officers. That field was actually the airfield parade ground, would you believe? Can't imagine it was very good at teaching people to march on wet grass, but I guess needs must. The Rookery, the little cut through between the castle and heading down to the road towards Ockhold. Again, very little change there. Even the telegraph pole in the woods, in the hedge on the right hand side, in exactly the same position. Looking from the very northern end of the runway directly south, almost in the direction of Mendlesham, the wind turbines on the airfield today and the power station, being able to grab your bearings there, in direct contrast to the wartime photograph taken in September 1944. The old curacy in Broome village was somewhat of an off-duty officers' club for the men of the base, and you can see the wartime photographs of it taken in the snow. That would be the winter of 1944. Again, other than the gap in the hedge that's been fully recovered, very little has changed in 70 plus years. Looking down the perimeter track on the northern end of the airfield, looking in the direction of Diss, exact same location. During the transition between the B-24 Liberators and the B-17 Flying Fortresses, several practice formation missions were being flown. In other words, the aircraft had no bombs or ammunition aboard, and they were simply flying the aircraft to familiarise the crews with the idiosyncrasies of flying them in comparison to the Liberators that they were used to. And on one such mission, 13th of August, a Sunday morning in 1944, again, as was so often the case, mid-air collision between two of the bombers. One landed at Thelneetham, and the other one landed, when I say landed, I mean crashed, the wreckage falling to earth at Thelneetham, the other one at Factory Lane, Roydon. And you can see the council house there has hardly changed in the intervening years, and the wreckage falling out of the sky, tumbling out of the sky and landing right in the front garden of the house, but didn't actually touch the house. There was a 9-year-old girl sleeping in the front bedroom at the time who was woken up by an enormous thump, and that was that aircraft coming to rest in their front garden. The airmen's living quarters on the accommodation site, Nicks Lane, Broome. You can still see the tree on the left hand side. It's the same tree that's in the wartime picture. some of the concrete bases where the huts were still remain. Some have returned to farmland. The earlier photograph showing the 829th putting down the first concrete at Potash Lane, still there today. And the officers and staff inspection by General Partridge, the date of this being the 12th of February 1945, looks like a very wet and miserable day. The barn at Church Farm still standing today, although it has been converted into a dwelling since this comparison photograph was taken, but clearly evident in the wartime picture. And looking from the north, looking south down the perimeter track, parallel with the A140, if we blend the wartime photograph in, we can see the exact location as it is today, with the squadron of flying fortresses just come off of the hard standings on the other side of the A140. The military police have closed the road while the bombers would have taxied across the main road and onto the active airfield. They're now heading up to the northern end of the runway to take off to the south. An aerial photograph I took maybe 5 years ago. The photographer in the previous photograph standing where the red star is, looking to the south, and you can clearly see from an elevated position what remains of the main runways, the operations block, one of the original aircraft hard standings, the parking revetments opposite the council dump, and the T2 aircraft hangar in Bartram's Yard, the former site of where the control tower would have been, demolished in the 1970s. Looking from the south, looking back north towards Diss, the main runway as accessible from Castledon Way, the intersecting cross runways, the Humphrey Empire and the wind turbines. When I took this photograph from the back seat of Morris Hammond's AT-6 Harvard, North American Aviation, 2 of the wind turbines had been put up, and the other 2 wind turbines, they'd put the concrete pads in, but they hadn't actually put the turbines on them at that stage. Some closing statistics. The 490th Bomb Group had the lowest combat losses of any 8th Air Force unit, 22 aircraft lost in combat. Interestingly, they actually lost more aircraft in non-combat operations than actually on active missions, 32 additional aircraft. The 490th Bomb Group flew their first mission on the 31st of May, their last mission on the 20th of April 45, and they carried out 158 missions in total, including 5 food drop missions to Holland in May 1945. They would typically send up 30 aircraft on each of those 158 separate missions. The aircraft departed the airfield on the 6th and the 8th of July 1945 respectively, and the ground echelon left Southampton docks on the 26th of August 45, with the group being officially deactivated at Drewfield, Florida on the 7th of November 1945. Thus the 490th Bomb Group Heavy went into the history books and the unit was no more. We must ensure that the sacrifices made by these young men who travelled over 4,000 miles to stand beside us in those dark days of the Second World War are remembered in the locality, particularly by the younger generations who are being raised in the local community, to help them understand, record this history. It's very important that it's not forgotten, and to justifiably honour those individuals who paid the ultimate price for the freedom that we all enjoy today, flying from airfields in the immediate locality.